Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. We are few in number this evening. And I told Marcia last week, I'm not preaching to you. You're just in my line of sight. Like it works out great with the way that y'all's sanctuary is. Because like y'all have the middle aisle. So, I always can just look straight down the middle and not like preach to anyone, right? Some churches, they don't have the middle aisle. So I'm just, whoever's on that back row in the middle, they're getting the full force of my wrath. But like here, because this is like a square, it's just, whoever sits right there, I'm just ends up preaching to them. So I don't have anyone to preach to this week. So I'm a little disappointed. We're in chapter 4 of James, so we're almost done. I mean, there's only 5 chapters. When we did chapter 3 last week, in some ways it seems like I just did chapter 3 like a couple days ago, but I guess it has been a whole week. When we did chapter 3, we recapped chapters 1 and 2. So now that we're doing chapter 4, we're going to recap chapter 3. But not recap chapters 1 and 2. So chapter 3 recap, there's nothing to fill in. I just gave it to you. So we talked about, James is probably addressing teachers who are promoting or participating in the favoritism and the discrimination that we read about in chapter 2. Because, this is where you get the whole teachers are going to be judged more strictly. And a lot of the, same sins of the tone language. One of the things talked about was cursing the image of God. How do we do that? Well, we show favoritism to some people and not to others, as if to essentially say, well, some people are made more in the image of God than others. The double-mindedness that we read about in chapter 1 kind of turns into double talk in chapter 2. Again, the whole sins of the tongue. In chapter 1, one of the things we talked about was the wise person persevering in word and in deed. And in chapter 3, James sort of reiterates this and he adds, right, who is wise, let them show it by their good life and by their deeds done in humility. People who, or one of the things we talked about in chapter 1 was people who persevere through life's trials with wisdom receive more wisdom and ultimately receive eternal life. And then in chapter 3, right, the people who have heavenly wisdom and pursue more heavenly wisdom, they will reap righteousness, right? And so, kind of left off chapter 3 talking about, right, reaping righteousness and also reaping peace. And then we get into chapter 4 and there's like anything but peace, right? So there's not really a great place to break chapter 4. Like my Bible has subheadings and it breaks it. It has like 1 through 12 and then 13 through 17. Obviously, as you can see from the outline, I did not do that. One commentary broke it. Let me see. 4, 1 through 5, and then 6 through 10, and then 4, 11 to 5, chapter 5, verse 6. We're not going to do that either because, I don't want to have to like get into chapter 5 tonight. And then there's one commentary that divided it, chapter 4, verses 1 through 10, and then verses 11 through 17, which was what I ended up going with. Because I do think, right, you get to verse 11, it has the brothers and sisters phrase, which, we talked about last week. Okay, usually that indicates like the start of a new section. And I think rightfully so. That is sort of a change in direction, although still piggybacking off of everything that came before it. And then also, like I said, I don't want to like get into 6 verses of chapter 5 tonight and then try to like finish it up next week. So we're going to start with the first 10 verses of chapter 4. So starting in verse 1, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you think Scripture says without reason that he hates jealously long for the... Sorry, what? I don't know where... Do you not know? Do you think the Scripture says without reason that he jealously longs for the Spirit he has caused to dwell in us? But he gives us more grace. That is why Scripture says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So, okay, got everything, bullet pointed. So it's like, okay, here's an idea, bullet point that. Here's an idea, bullet point that. First bullet point, one of the things we see is, once again, right, this theme of infighting, right? I mean, we've seen this several times, right? We talked about this in chapter 1, how kind of get hints of it. By the time we get into chapter 2, kind of spells it out with the whole rich versus poor, legal injustice idea. Chapter 3, right, we still have that, but it's more focused on like the preachers and, sins of the tongue kind of a thing. And then here in chapter 4, it's like, it's just all out chaos seemingly in terms of like this infighting. Right. And so, it talks about in verse 1, fights and quarrels among the people or among the church. Right. And so, I mean, I've sort of been tracing this from chapter 2 into chapter 3, and then now I'm going to attempt to do it into chapter 4. This whole like rich versus poor thing, right? James had, kind of gets a bad rap because people say, oh, well, James is just sort of all over the place, right? Which in a way, I mean, he kind of is. But I think, right, if you had to say, okay, this is sort of the overarching thing that James is dealing with, it's the rich versus poor idea, right? I mean, there's even been books written like, Rich and Poor in the Book of James or whatever. And if I had more free time, I would have loved to read that in preparation for this. So, right, I mean, this division of rich and poor that we see in chapter 2 would sort of naturally lead into, these fights and quarrels among the church that we read about in chapter 4. So, I do think it is connected in some sense, even if loosely. So then this is your blank for this bullet point. James is likely dealing with side effects of the main issue addressed in the previous chapters, right? If you have this rich versus poor, if you have this, legal injustice and not only people committing it, but pastors promoting it, it's going to lead to fights and quarrels in the church. So we can see how it's all connected. This going on to the next bullet point, the next idea. This is a quote from one of the commentaries that I pulled out. It says, the term wars and fighting are often understood to be used by James metaphorically. So he says, what James refers to then would be verbal disputes that are rampant throughout the congregation. And he says this is possible in light of what he says concerning the sins of the tongue in chapter 3. But that same guy also goes on to say, at the same time, right, it is very likely that in addition to the verbal dispute, there was actual physical altercations or potentially murder going on. So we want to keep both in mind, right? I mean, clearly you have the quarreling, which is generally associated with words, but then we also have the killing language, the murder language. So we don't want to say it's all sins of the tongue, right? There's probably a little bit of both. And so, right, this is, I gave you sort of a very long sentence and then you're fill in the blank. So I guess this is the start of that really long sentence for your fill in the blank. Chapter 2 deals with those who participate in or benefit from favoritism and discrimination. Chapter 3 deals with the preachers who are complicit with the favoritism and discrimination through their preaching, right? They promote it. Chapter 4, which is where we're at now, deals with, and this is your blank specifically, deals with the church as a whole, which is involved in verbal infighting, at the very least. So chapter 4 deals with the church as a whole, which is involved in verbal infighting, or just verbal fighting, verbal disagreements, at the very least, and potentially physical infighting as well. Again, the obvious connection to chapter 3 would be the whole verbal sins of the tongue idea. Even though, yeah, there very well could have been like physical altercations going on. So moving on to the next bullet point. In verse 2, right, that's where we have the mention of murder. It says, you desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. And so, right, I mean, I said, okay, there's this possibility that there was physical fighting, there was actual violence, and, right, I mean, even potentially murder taking place. Regardless of, right, I mean, whether there was an actual murder or murders going on. It is interesting. This is the second time that James has mentioned murder in this book. The first time is in verse 11 of chapter 2, right? He who said you shall not commit adultery also said you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker, right? So James uses do not murder as one of the example commands, so to speak, that he uses to point out lawbreakers for, loving your neighbor as yourself, for the sum of the old law, right? And chapter 2, it's all about legal injustice that's taking place. And, maybe, okay, we have murder in chapter 2 and we have murder here in chapter 4. And this might serve as a tie back to that legal injustice that's taking place in chapter 2. James also says, right, you do not have because you do not ask God. When you do ask, you don't receive because you asked with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures, right? Another tie back to previous chapters, chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, very similar thing to the whole, like, you ask but you don't receive thing, right? It says, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, yada, yada, yada. Verse 6, when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Again, very similar to what we find in chapter 4. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. So, we have, again, these loose kind of connections to the previous chapters. In the case of chapter 4, right, in the case of chapter 1, these double-minded people, right, they don't receive wisdom. In the case of chapter 4, what these people are asking for, it's a little less clear. What they're asking for, but they don't receive, it's a little less clear. All right, James is condemning covetousness in verse 2. And then, right, he immediately adds, you do not have because you do not ask God. So seemingly, right, James is implying that the solution is not to covet what other people have. Likely, right, don't covet what the rich people have, but to instead ask God, right? And then he adds, but even if you do ask God, right, you're not gonna receive, you're not gonna get that. Why? Because, right, they only want what others have, so they too can spend what you get on your pleasures, right? And then this, I think, is the start of your blank. The poor, for as much as they seem to have been the recipients, I guess should be the word I have used there, the recipients of injustice, they're also potentially at fault here. They don't want justice applied equally. In fact, they want injustice applied equally. Potentially, if that is the route that James is going here. Right. I'm not mad that I got messed over. I'm just, mad that I didn't get to be the one to mess somebody over. Right. It's an attitude of revenge, essentially. Right. And this sort of makes sense given the whole Civil War description that, we seem to get in chapter 4. It's not really a fight if one side is just pummeling the other with no retaliation, no revenge. Right. So yeah, you have, you do not ask because you do not, or you do not have because you do not ask. When you do ask, you do not receive. Why? Because you asked with the wrong motives. Well, yeah, those motives are likely revenge, right? The poor were probably legally, or in some sort of legal courtroom context were, done dirty, so to speak. And so now, right, they're, coveting the rich. They're like, I want to be the rich. I want to be that guy. Why? So they can give all their money to the poor and bless the nations? No, so that they can get revenge on the rich people that did them wrong. So anyway, next bullet point. Right. I did say, right, that there was potential for actual murder, dun, 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 taking place in the church. In addition to these verbal disagreements, right, this is another quote. It says, to say that all James means here is hate, or these verbal disagreements, overlooks the fact that the letter of James was likely written in a period when murder was accepted as a religious way to solve disagreements, which to us is kind of like insane, right? I don't know, maybe not. We had like cults and stuff last century that like murdered people, but us little Southern Baptist, good boys and girls, right? Hopefully, anyway, we're not solving our religious disagreements by murdering each other. I would hope not. So, right, what is he even talking about? Well, right, this commentator goes on to talk about, right, the zealots, right, the zealot movement, right, all about sneaking up behind the Romans, stabbing them in the back, right, partly for political reasons, but also partly for religious reasons as well, right? It was a religious movement. Same commentary, right? He also points out that the zealots had a hatred for the wealthy. So again, this whole rich versus poor dynamic that we see in chapter 2, chapter 3, and now chapter 4. Okay, if we did have actual murder, and the context for it is the zealots, makes sense because the zealots hated wealthy people. So we can see how, right, this could have led to actual murder, especially since, right, James is likely writing to a Jewish audience here. The poor covet from the rich and likely want to oppress the rich, and then this is your blank. The zealots could have gotten involved and started murdering in an attempt to solve the injustice.
What was that? What was it?
The zealots could have gotten involved and started murdering.
That they were zealot. Yeah, they were a group of people that they were in Jesus' day. Too. They were stirred up stuff then too.
Yeah, probably. I guess most famously known for Masada. Is that the
yes?
Yeah, on the giant hill or mountain, right? Bunch of them got together, and this was during the Jewish revolt against the Romans around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. And a bunch of them got together, and they fortified themselves on I'm just going to call it a giant hill because that's basically what it is, called Masada. And right, basically the Romans came knocking. They said, we're not going to open up. We're going to stay up here. And, they besieged it for a long time, and it was kind of a stalemate. And eventually they just made these giant stairway-looking things, came over there, and all of the zealots inside, they said, okay, yeah, we're probably going to be killed anyway, so we're just going to, like, pick straws, and we're going to, whoever gets the short straw is going to, like, murder all of us, and then he's going to turn around and kill himself because we don't want to die at the hands of the Romans.
Like the Jim Jones thing.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, in a sense, I guess. But anyway, they made like a TV series about it, like back when you were a young man. So, that's probably like the thing that they're most known for historically. Kind of like the Battle of 300 in a sense, just because, yeah, even though they failed, it is sort of impressive that they were able to withstand that long. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked with my history lesson. So anyway, right? It was a huge mess, regardless of how it played out, regardless of if it's even referring to actual murder, and if it was murder, was it zealots, was it not zealots, right? Regardless of all of that, I mean, it was a huge mess that the church had on its hands. But right, if it was referring to literal murder, and if it was the zealot movement, then the church really was on the brink of extinction, right? This church, anyway. I don't know that the church as a whole was, but whoever James is writing to was likely, had James not stepped in, they all could have just murdered each other, which is kind of terrible to think about. But anyway, moving on. Next bullet point. Verse 4 is kind of hard to understand. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God, right? Now, that in and of itself, I don't know, is that difficult to understand application-wise? But in terms of, like, what exactly is James's context here, that gets kind of weird, right? Obviously murdering and coveting are bad. But murdering a rich person, also, another thing I'll point out with the whole zealot thing, and then I'll shut up about it. But the wealthy people that were bringing poor people to the church court, right? Those wealthy people were likely Romans. So again, the zealot movement is part religious, part political. I hate the Romans so much, I'm going to murder them, right? I mean, that would also make sense given James's context of, okay, if you have this rich and poor dynamic, and the rich people are Romans and the poor people are all Jewish, if there's an actual murder, that would lend more credence to the fact that it would be like the zealot movement. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Murdering, right, the rich, coveting from the rich, right? Obviously, those are bad, but you would kind of do that for your own benefit, right? Because I mean, the whole being a friend of the world thing, right? I mean, how exactly would murdering the rich be buddying up to the world, right? You kind of do that for your own benefit, not necessarily for, trying to, be friends with the world. So in that sense, right, when I say James's context is kind of difficult to understand, that's what I'm referring to. And then this is your blank. James could, emphasis on the could part, have worldliness in mind rather than those people outside of the church, right? So being friends with the world isn't necessarily right. I'm murdering and I'm coveting and I'm fighting and quarreling to befriend the world in the sense of, right, people outside of the covenant community, but rather I'm befriending worldliness, right? And then this is also a blank. This would make sense because the adultery language in verse 4 is likely used metaphorically to describe idolatry. Right. I mean, you remember we just covered Hosea where, Gomer is a harlot. And in the same way, Hosea says all of Israel has committed adultery against God. And adultery was a stand-in for idolatry, unfaithfulness to God. So these right, Christians, air quotes, that James is addressing, right, who James would likely say that they aren't even true believers, right? They become friends with worldliness or friends with the world, right? Through this fighting, this quarreling, this coveting what you cannot get, or coveting what you want but cannot get. The killing and murdering, right? They become friends with worldliness, and right. And the more that this section goes on, you're going to see, this idea of, the internal struggle, the flesh versus, right, being single-minded towards Christ, right? And again, nobody is perfect, and James certainly isn't saying that, but, there is sort of a line for James of you're so focused on the flesh that you're no longer single-minded towards Christ, you're double-minded. With one hand, you're reaching out towards Christ, and the other, you're reaching out towards the flesh or towards the world, right? So anyway, no blanks for the next 3 bullet points. Real quick, just sort of 1, 2, 3. Verse 1 of this chapter, James says that the fights and quarrels come from within those. I worded that very weirdly, I just realized. Comes from within the hearts of the people in the church, not just within people in the church. Worded that super weird, but yeah. What he says is, right, what causes the fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from within you? As in, right, each and every individual person, it's coming from within them. Not just like within the church, as in like, well, it's coming from within the church. The fights and quarrels are coming from outside of the church, right? But within the individual people, right? And again, I put in parentheses, the inner battle of godliness versus the flesh. Next bullet point. These double-minded Christians, again, in quotes, have become friends with worldliness, right? They're choosing the flesh. They're double-minded. Therefore, next bullet point, therefore they are an enemy to God, and they do not receive what they ask for in prayer. Before we get into verses 11 through 17, I will just point out a couple things in the last few verses here of this section that I want to point out. They sort of re-emphasize things that we've already seen. So verse 7, right? Submit yourselves to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. So resist the devil is in opposition, obviously, to submitting yourselves to God. So again, sort of affirming this, right, battle between the flesh and single-mindedness towards Christ. This idea of being friends with the world and, as opposed to submitting yourself to God. And it also ties back into chapter 3. James talked about earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. And he's traced back the origin of earthly wisdom to the demonic realm. And then now in chapter 4, James says, resist the devil. Verse 8 also kind of reemphasizes some things we've already seen. Talks about, it uses the phrase, you double-minded. Again, pointing out this ongoing war with the flesh, pursuing the flesh versus pursuing Christ. In chapter 1, right, talked about people who are double-minded, they don't persevere, and they don't receive eternity, right? If you remember from the recap from last week of chapter 1, right, the people who don't persevere don't receive wisdom, they don't receive blessing, and ultimately they don't receive eternity, right? Well, in chapter 4, he doesn't necessarily say, that the double-minded don't receive eternity. What he does say is that the double-minded are at enmity with God. That's 1. They're not in submission to God. Strike 2. And they do not purify their hearts. Strike 3. So even though he doesn't say it, right? I mean, yeah, basically he's saying, okay, these double-minded people, they're not going to receive eternity, right? And there is, perhaps unstated, but I think there is nonetheless, the idea that it's not too late for these people, obviously, right? I mean, James advocates for repentance, right? But as these people are going now, the future is looking rather bleak for them and for the church as a whole. So anyway, moving on to verses 11 through 17. Brothers and sisters, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. So, for time's sake, I'm going to boil this all down to two main points, which is why we have the 1 and we have the 2. We've progressed beyond bullet points into numerals. And so the ideas are, and you can just go ahead and fill this in now. It's the first blank by the 1 and the first blank by the 2. So the 2 main ideas are judging others, or just judgment, and the idea of God's will. That would be the first blank by 2. And I think both of these concepts, like a lot of stuff in the book of James, has kind of been misunderstood, right? And again, I don't know that the application, at least on the judging others portion, is necessarily like completely out of line. But I think, right, understanding James's context of why specifically is he saying this, and what is the context for what James is actually getting at, I think we kind of lose that. And so in that way, it's sort of misunderstood. But we'll start with judgment, with judging others, right? Clearly, James has in mind here, this is your blank. James has in mind here interactions between believers, right? It says brothers and sisters in Christ, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against the law and judges it. And I don't know why my Bible did this, because, this isn't a study Bible, and most of the footnotes are either textual variants or like cross-references if it's like a direct quote of another part of Scripture. But for whatever reason, and I'm glad that they did this, they footnoted the second use of brother and sister in verse 11. And it said, the Greek word for brother or sister, adelphos, refers here to a believer, part of God's family, right? Which, was obvious from the context anyway, but the fact that they pointed that out is helpful. And this isn't to say that the New Testament says nothing about, interactions between people in general and just judgment in general, regardless of whether or not it's inside the church or outside the church, right? But we're only going to focus on what James has to say, right? We're not going to get into the idea of judgment in general and talk about what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, right? We're just going to focus on James. Right. And obviously, I mean, James has, in air quotes, okay, judged, as people in the world would kind of use that term, has judged other people who are not doers of the word, right? He's kind of judged them to not be true believers at all, right? I mean, we've seen that in just about every chapter so far, right? So, right, I mean, James isn't saying, right, you should never call out anyone for anything bad that they do ever, and you should just, let everything slide, right? Obviously, I mean, James specifically talked against that last chapter where you have preachers who are letting slide this, rich versus poor, ripping people off thing that we see in chapter 2, right? So, yeah, I mean, James obviously, right, he's not pulling a 180 on us. What he's talking about is a genuine believer who is judging, in some sense, another genuine believer. The question is, okay, what is the nature of the judgment, right? I mean, just judgment doesn't really key us in on anything, right? Is it, I'm judging you because you're poor and you don't drive a Lambo like me? Or, I guess in James's time, you're poor, so you don't have a jewel-encrusted horse-drawn carriage like me or whatever, Chariot. Right? Chariots like me. Or is it, I'm judging you according to a man-made standard, right? Sort of legalism. What is the nature of the judgment that James is addressing here? And it's not entirely obvious, right? It's not very clear. And I don't really know that it has to be, in a sense. I think that I'm kind of okay with it being a little bit vague. But right, we're gonna try to connect it to what comes before. James uses the word slander, right? Brothers and sisters, verse 11, do not slander one another. So we're keeping this theme of sins of the tongue, right? And if we're keeping this theme of sins of the tongue, right, again, we're probably still kind of dealing with this rich versus poor theme that we see all throughout the book. He also uses the word law. Also in verse 11, when you judge the law, let me back up. When you judge them, when you judge a brother or sister, right, that person speaks against the law and judges the law. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. So when he uses that word, again, he's talking about the sum of the law, right? The, love your neighbor as yourself thing that he got into in chapter 2. So in other words, right, anyone who slanders their brother not only judges their brother and sister in Christ, and slander, let me back up. Slander is sort of a judgment in a sense, right? I guess slander would have to be like knowingly saying something, right? I don't know, maybe that's not a requirement, but in either way, right? It's pronouncing something potentially based on bad information or potentially knowingly, right, that has ramifications for that person. So it's essentially placing a judgment on them that is undeserved, right? If that makes sense. I don't know that I did a great job of explaining that. But anyway, so it is a judgment in a sense. Anyone who slanders their brother or sister not only judges them, but they also judge the sum of the law itself, right? And so likely what James means is that they are essentially judges, or trying to be anyway, judges of the law, right? Because James points out in verse 12, right, that's Jesus's job, right? And I think, yeah, this is your blank. Jesus alone can judge a believer because Jesus alone can judge the law itself, right? People who they're slandering, which is a judgment in a sense, right? Oh, well, I saw Wilma honky-tonking it the other weekend. That would be slandering Wilma in a sense, right? That's kind of, in a sense, pronouncing a judgment on her because obviously, and I don't know, obviously we shouldn't do this, but being the fallen humans we are, right? We're going to treat Wilma differently now, knowing that she's a honky-tonker on the weekends and a church-going lady on Sundays, right? So I'm essentially pronouncing a judgment on her based on, right, a faulty premise, because obviously Wilma does not go honky-tonking on the weekends. Or if she does, she's just really good at hiding it. No, I'm kidding. So that would be sort of pronouncing a judgment on Wilma. Your punishment is we're all gonna, we're gonna shun you in church now, basically. And so when I do that, when I say that against Wilma, right, I'm essentially becoming a judge of the law, right? Because I say, oh, well, Wilma is breaking the law. So in other words, I'm sort of determining what even is the law and what isn't the law, which only Jesus can do because only Jesus kept the law. And also, as God in human form, right, Jesus modified this distinction that we see in James between the old law and the sum of the law, love your neighbor as yourself, that James says, hey, you need to live like you're under that, right? You need to live like, well, let me pull it up. Those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, right? And again, I mean, this doesn't quite answer, right, what exactly is the judgment of the nature? What was being said by the rich to the poor, or by the poor to the rich, or by something completely different, right? It doesn't really answer what was being said that was slanderous. But again, I don't really know that part matters as much as the overall, when you slander or when you judge another believer, you're essentially becoming a judge of the law, which James has already pointed out in chapter 2 that we can't do because we are all lawbreakers, right? And then in verse 12 of chapter 4, he says, right, the only one who can do that is Jesus. There's one lawgiver and one judge, the one who is able to save you, who is able to save and destroy. But you, right, who are you to judge your neighbors, right? And obviously, right, I mean, slandering my brother and sister in Christ, that would be a violation of loving my neighbor. How does Jesus judge rightly in regards to slander? Well, again, tying this back into what we see earlier in chapter 4, okay, we have this sort of civil war that's breaking out in the church. There's infighting going on, right? Just for simplicity's sake, pretend that this is going on here, right? Y'all, this half the room is, rich people. We're the poor people or whatever, right? And I'm mad at y'all rich people, so I slander you, right? Well, I'm doing that in a sense, right? If this is coming out of this division in the church, I'm doing that because, I can't see with full clarity both sides of this infighting, right? So whatever slander, whatever judgment I give, even if in theory what I said had some truth to it, it would still be wrong because the only reason I'm doing this is because I'm mad about this infighting that's happening in the church, and I cannot look objectively at what is happening in the church because I'm only human. Jesus, on the other hand, James points out, can judge, right? And in the context, again, of this church division, right? He can judge because Jesus can look objectively at church infighting, right? Because does Jesus take a side when it comes to infighting in the church? No. Jesus is the side, right? We need to ask ourselves, right? Are we siding with Jesus? Not is Jesus siding with us, right? So whatever judgment that I try to pronounce on people, right, obviously is going to be flawed to some extent because I do not have the full picture, because I am not God. I cannot give a clear judgment. In my war with the flesh, right, I just resort to slander. I just resort to saying mean things about Wilma or whatever the case is, right? So anyway. Okay, actually, we have one more blank that I didn't notice until I turned the page. When I judge you, I become a judge of the law itself. You probably picked up on that. But again, I can't judge the law itself because, as James points out, I'm a lawbreaker, right? We all have, to some degree, broken loving our neighbor as ourselves. Even if we've never committed adultery or murdered, we've all, to some extent, broken that sum of the Old Testament law. So, okay. Numeral 2, God's will. Try to move quickly through this. This has also caused some confusion. It wasn't too terribly long ago. There was this sort of, I don't really want to call it a movement. I don't know what to call it, but there was, this belief, I guess, that it's like, everything you said, you had to end it with Lord willing, right? And I think that this was like a Southern thing, which I guess, like, we're technically Southern, right? But, like, I heard this a lot from people in, like, the, like, Deep South, or, like, maybe
Texas.
Oh, I mean, like the people with the, I'm from Georgia, or like that part of the South. I don't know. Where it's like everything had to be like, Lord willing, right? And it didn't matter what it was. It's like, like, oh, I'm gonna go pick up groceries tomorrow. You're gonna go pick up groceries tomorrow, Lord willing, right? As if it was like, God was gonna strike you down if you didn't add that to the end of your sentence, right? I don't really think that that's what James is getting at. I don't think he means that you have to say that at the end of every say. If that is your conviction, I'm not gonna judge you for that. I'm not gonna slander you if that's your conviction. But I don't think contextually that that's what James is getting at. What James is dealing with, this is your blank, is the pursuit of money. The pursuit of money, right? We get this from verse 30. Listen, you who say, today consider that, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money, right? So James is dealing with this idea of the pursuit of money, and then, this is also the next blank. James has already addressed the fleeting nature of wealth in chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. Right, and I'll reread that. Chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. The rich should, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with the scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business, right? So James has already said, hey, don't take pride in your wealth because that's here today and gone tomorrow, right? And even if you live your whole earthly life with wealth, it's not like that necessarily translates into spiritual wealth in the afterlife. So James has already dealt with the fleeting nature of wealth, and that's pretty much what he's dealing with again here, right? Dealing with people who have essentially idolized not necessarily wealth itself, but the pursuit of wealth, which often goes hand in hand with wealth itself, right? I don't, if you've ever watched like those History Channel documentaries about like the turn of the 20th century and how you started having like more wealth, but it was distributed like very unequally. So like you had more money in the economy, but it was going to like, a dozen or so people who like, oh, I own like half of the railroads in America, so I'm like a millionaire. Or, oh, I'm Henry Ford and I, invented the car. Yes, I know he didn't invent the car, but whatever. And so, oh, I'm like a millionaire, right? If you watch those documentaries, right, I don't remember which like early millionaire it was in America, but one of those people said or they were asked the question. They were asked, how much money is enough? And they said, one more dollar, right? So it wasn't just like wealth; it was the pursuit of wealth. It's it's like gambling, right? Like obviously people gamble when they're behind, but you also have people that have already struck it, still gamble, and you're like, well, why would you even need to gamble at this point? And they're like, hey, man, one more dollar, one more win, right? They're idolizing the pursuit of wealth in addition to wealth itself. And so in that sense, right, I mean, they really have become friends of the world, right? Obviously, doing business with the world is not sinful, and James is not saying that, but when that's, waking up tomorrow, why? So I can carry on business and make money, right? At that point, you might want to question yourself, okay, if the only reason if the only thing I'm thinking about tomorrow is, I'm going to make money, right? Like, you might want to, question your priorities in life. You're becoming friends with the world. In that sense, they really are like buddying up to the world because they're solely focused on one more dollar, right? And so, I don't think James is saying that like you need to add Lord willing to the end of like every single sentence you're saying. What he's getting at is, right, don't pursue riches, pursue God. And if God wills you to be wealthy, then that's going to happen, right? But James is talking about, right, why are you so focused on the pursuit of wealth, right? In verse 14, you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? What is your life? It's just a mist. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow, right? Why are you pursuing wealth? Pursue God. And if God wills you to be wealthy, then that's what's going to happen, right? Blindedness. I know what I should do. I should trust God. I should boast in him. But I don't do that, right? And instead, I boast in my get-rich-quick scheme. And James says, right, to do that is to sin, right? Knowing that I should trust God, knowing that I should be pursuing him, and not doing that, right? I mean, that's sin just as much as like, I'll end on this. Say that you're a poor person who, right, you're not wealthy, but you're idolizing wealth. You're idolizing the pursuit of wealth, right? Even if you're not actually wealthy. You're just as much sinning as the wealthy person who is using their wealth to, right, cause harm to poor people, or using their wealth to get favoritism in church court, right? James says, hey, you're just as guilty, even if you're not wealthy yourself, if that's what you're pursuing, right? So anyway, any questions or anything before I hand it off? All right.